Welcome back to Dirty Laundry, the channel where we hang out the stories most people would rather keep hidden, the hard choices, the buried secrets, and the quiet acts of courage that change a life forever. If you believe that even the most ordinary person can be handed the most impossible decision, settle in, pour yourself something warm, and stay with us to the very end, because today's story will stay with you long after it's over. And if stories about love, conscience, and second chances are why you're here, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next one. For 40 years, Ruth Callahan had taught children the difference between right and wrong. But at 67, a widow in a quiet town, with a phone that never rang and a daughter 1,100 miles and 3 silent years away, she had come to believe her life no longer mattered to anyone. Then, on a freezing December afternoon, she stood alone on an old bridge and watched a school bus full of children sliding toward death. In her hands lay a single rusted lever and a choice no human being should ever have to make. What she decided in those 5 seconds would put her on trial, turn her town against her, and very nearly cost her freedom. But it would also lead her, against all hope, to forgiveness she did not deserve, to the family she thought she had lost, and to a truth that took her 67 years to learn, that it is never too late to matter, never too late to be brave, and never too late to come home. If you have ever wondered whether your life still counts, this story is for you. The cold arrived first. It slipped through Ruth Callahan's worn wool gloves and into the bones of her fingers. The same hands that had graded 40 years of penmanship and buttoned countless small coats against December winds. She stood on the old iron footbridge that crossed the Sawkill at the eastern edge of Cedar Falls, the river running dark and slow beneath the ice, and below her, the world was about to come apart. But to understand why a 67-year-old widow was standing on that bridge at all, with the fate of strangers about to fall into her frozen hand, we have to go back a few hours, to a morning, like every other morning she had lived since Walter died. She had risen at 6, the way she always did, and made coffee in the old percolator that still brewed enough for 2. That was the habit she could not break. 4 years now since Walter's heart had simply stopped at the kitchen sink, and still she filled the basket for 2 cups each morning and poured the second one quietly down the drain, as though some part of her were keeping a place set at a table that would never be full again. Her daughter, Diane, lived 1,100 miles away, in a city Ruth had visited exactly twice, and the silence between them had widened over 3 years into something neither of them seemed able to cross. On the windowsill by the door lay a letter Ruth had written to her, begun 11 days ago and never sent, the ink of her daughter's name beginning to feel like an accusation. She told herself she would mail it. She told herself a great many things in those long, quiet mornings. The house did not help. It had been built for a family, and a family had filled it once, the small thunder of Diane running the upstairs hall, Walter's low voice reading at night through the thin walls, the smell of Sunday cooking. Now the rooms held only their own echoes. Ruth had taken lately to leaving the radio on for company, some station out of the next county that played the old songs, and to talking aloud to the cat that had wandered up the porch one autumn and stayed, because a voice in the house, even her own, was better than the silence pressing in from every corner. Once she had commanded a classroom, 30 small faces turning to her like flowers to a window. She had been somebody then, Mrs. Callahan, who knew every child's name and which ones needed an extra word at the door. Now the chalk was gone from her fingers, and her days were a slow procession of solitary coffee, a garden no one came to see, and books she finished with no one to tell about them. The town of Cedar Falls, with its shuttered paper mill and its one diner on Main Street, had a way of forgetting its old women, folding them quietly into the wallpaper until they were less like people and more like the furniture of a place, present and unremarked. That morning, restless in a way she could not name, a heaviness in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite fear. Ruth had taken Walter's blue scarf from its hook by the door, the soft wool one he had given her one long ago Christmas, smelling faintly still of the cedar chest, and wound it at her throat, and pulled on her heavy coat, and walked out into the cold toward the bridge, the way she sometimes did when the house grew too loud with its own emptiness. The sky was the flat dead white of coming snow. Down the valley, she heard the low, patient moan of the freight train sounding its horn at the crossing. 80 cars of coal out of the old mill yards, running its schedule the way it had run for 50 years. And then another sound cut across it, a high, rising mechanical whine, the shriek of tires that had lost their grip on ice. Ruth turned, coming down the long hill toward the level crossing, sliding sideways. Fighting a wheel that had given up its argument with the road was a yellow school bus, its windows fogged with the breath of children, sliding straight and helpless toward the tracks, where the freight train was already roaring out of the white. Ruth's gloved hand closed, without her deciding it, around the cold iron of a rusted switch lever she had never once noticed in all her years of walking that bridge. The bus came down the hill the way a thing comes that cannot stop. Ruth had time to see it whole, the dented yellow flank, the small pale faces pressed to the fogged windows, the driver hauling at a wheel that had given up its argument with the ice. The road ran straight to the level crossing, and the crossing ran straight to the freight train, and the freight train, 80 cars of coal out of the old mill yards, blew its long horn into the white afternoon, as though sounding for a funeral it did not yet know it was attending. 5 seconds, perhaps fewer. Ruth would spend the rest of her life trying to count them honestly. Her hand was already on the switch. She had not decided to put it there. It had simply gone, the way her hand used to go up to quiet a classroom before her mind had framed the words. The iron was so cold, it felt like a burn straight through her glove. She understood the lever the way you understand a thing in a dream, all at once and without being told. Pull it, and the freight would throw onto the rusted spur that curved east toward the old paper mill. Leave it, and the train would hold its line, straight through the crossing, straight through the sliding bus and the small fogged faces. There was no third thing. The afternoon offered her only the two. But the spur was not empty. She saw him then, far down where the rusted track ran into the bare birches, a man in an orange coat, bent over the rail with a long-handled tool, alone. the way men who keep old lines are always alone. He had not heard the horn over his own work and the wind. He did not know that the next 10 seconds had already chosen him, or chosen Ruth to choose him. Later, in the worst hours of the winter, Ruth would try to tell herself she had waited, that there had been some calculation, some grim arithmetic of 5 against 1 that a court could understand and a conscience could survive. It was not true. There had been no arithmetic. There had been a bus full of children she could not bear to watch die, and a man too far away to be more than a shape, and her own 2 hands, and a cold so deep it had gone all the way to the marrow of her. She pulled the lever. It did not move. It had not been thrown in years, and the rust held it like a held breath. And Ruth, 67 years old, a widow who had not lifted anything heavier than a watering can in 4 years, put the whole of her small weight against it, and felt something in her shoulder tear and the iron groan and finally, terribly, give. The points shifted with a clang that she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her days. The freight took the spur. Ruth felt the ground shudder as 80 cars of coal swung east, and she watched the bus slide harmless across the empty crossing and bury its nose in a snowbank on the far side. And she heard, thin over the roar, the sound of children screaming and screaming, which meant that they were alive. And down the spur, the man in the orange coat looked up. Afterward, she could never be certain of what passed between them in that last second before the trees and the train hid him. She thought he saw her on the bridge with her hand still on the lever. She thought he understood what she had done and why. She thought she would always think that he gave her a single small nod, the nod of one tired soul to another, an absolution offered in the only time he had left. But the snow was thick, and the distance was great, and her own eyes were old and full of tears, and in the months to come she would not be able to swear to any of it. She would only know that she had seen an orange coat, and then she had not. The train passed. The spur was empty where the man had been. Ruth's hand came off the lever at last, the glove peeling away from the frozen iron with a small sound. She became aware that she was making a noise herself, low and wordless, and that her knees had gone, and she sank down onto the snow-covered planks of the bridge with her back against the cold rail, her wool gloves, the blue scarf at her throat that Walter had given her one Christmas a lifetime ago. The white sky pressing down all of it seemed very far away, on the other side of a pane of glass. She had saved them. She had saved the children. She held that fact in front of her like a lamp, because she already knew that behind it, in the dark, something else was waiting. Down in the valley, the bus doors banged open and the screaming resolved into voices. A horn somewhere began to call for help, and the wind off the Sawkill carried up to the old bridge, faint and rising, the first thin wail of a siren. The siren came up the valley road and stopped at the foot of the bridge, and after that the quiet world Ruth had been sitting in broke apart into noise and motion. Doors slammed, boots crunched the snow. Somewhere below, a man was shouting numbers into a radio. The cold clipped numbers of an emergency, and the words meant nothing to Ruth, who sat with her back against the rail and her torn shoulder beginning slowly to announce itself in long pulses of pain. she received as though they belonged to someone else. A young deputy reached her first. He could not have been more than 25, his face raw with the cold and with whatever he had seen down at the crossing. And he crouched in front of her, the way a person crouches in front of a child or a frightened animal. Ma'am, are you hurt? Can you tell me your name?" Ruth opened her mouth. The wind off the Sawkill had numbed her lips, and for a moment her own name would not come, which frightened her more than the pain, though she did not yet understand why it should. "Callahan," she managed at last. "Ruth Callahan. I taught at the elementary for 40 years. She did not know why she added that, except that it seemed important. Suddenly, that someone know she had been useful once. "Are you hurt, Mrs. Callahan?" "My shoulder. It doesn't matter." She looked past him, down toward the crossing, where the world was a confusion of flashing lights and small blanketed shapes being carried from the snowbank. "The children, please." "Are the children?" "They're alive." The deputy's voice cracked on it, young as he was. "All of them. Scrapes and a broken arm. That's the worst of it. Mrs. Delgado's girl bit her tongue and won't stop crying. But she's fine. She's fine." He swallowed. "You threw the switch. Folks down there saw you. You sent the train onto the spur." Ruth said nothing. Below, a mother in a thin coat with no time to grab a heavier one was clutching a small boy against her chest and rocking, and another woman was running the line of stretchers, calling a name. And the children who could walk stood in a stunned little cluster, being draped in foil blankets that caught the light, like something festive, which was obscene, and which Ruth could not stop looking at. A paramedic came and pressed a paper cup of coffee into her hands. She held it. She did not drink. The steam rose between her cold fingers, and she thought, with a strange detachment, of the percolator at home that still brewed for two, and of the second cup she poured down the sink each morning, and of how she had never once imagined that the loneliness of that small ritual would come to seem like a kind of luxury, a grief she had at least chosen. An older officer came up the bridge, a man with a gray mustache and a notebook, gentler than his size suggested. He let her sit. He asked his questions slowly. What had she been doing on the bridge? Walking. She walked sometimes. There was nothing else to fill the mornings. Had she seen the bus lose control? Yes. Had she understood what the switch would do? Yes. God help her. Yes, she answered in a flat voice that did not sound like her own. And the officer wrote, and the snow fell on his notebook and melted on the ink. There was one thing she did not say. She did not tell him about the man in the orange coat. She told herself, in the moment, that it was because she could not bear to say the words out loud, that to speak of him was to make him real and dead and hers. But underneath that, in a place she would not look at for weeks, there was a smaller and more frightening reason she was no longer entirely sure of what she had seen. An orange coat. Yes. A figure bent over the rail, but the nod, the small tired nod she thought he had given her, that she could not have sworn to, and a part of her had already begun, without permission, to wonder whether her old eyes and her terror had simply given her a kindness that was never there. So she said nothing about him at all. Not yet. Is there someone we can call for you? Mrs. Callahan, the officer asked, closing his notebook. Family, a husband, a son. The question landed somewhere soft and bruised. Ruth looked at the cooling coffee in her hands. My husband died 4 years ago, she said. My daughter lives in another state. We don't. She stopped. There was no honest end to that sentence she wished to give a stranger. There's no one to call, she said finally. I'll be all right on my own. I've had practice. The officer's face did not change, but something behind his eyes did, and he said, more gently still, "We'll get you looked at then and run you home." He paused and seemed to decide something and asked the question that would open the door to all the rest of it, the question that would walk beside Ruth through the whole long winter to come. "Do you have any idea," he said, "who that man was, the one on the tracks?" Ruth lifted her eyes from the coffee. Down at the crossing, they had stopped carrying children. They had begun, with a different and slower carefulness, to carry something else, and the foil blankets had been put away, and the snow came down on the silent stretcher, the way it comes down on everything, without preference, without mercy, covering the saved and the lost alike. "No," Ruth whispered. "I never saw his face." They drove her home in a patrol car that smelled of cold vinyl and someone else's cigarettes, and the young deputy walked her to the door of the house on Maple Street and waited, awkward and kind, until she had the key in the lock. She thanked him. She did not invite him in. When the car had gone, she stood a moment in her own dark hallway, still in the navy coat, the blue scarf at her throat, and the silence of the house came up to meet her, the way deep water meets a stone, closing over without a ripple. She did not sleep that night, nor much for many nights after. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and a cup of tea she did not drink, and her torn shoulder throbbed in time with the old clock in the hall. And she waited for a morning that came gray and slow over the rooftops of Cedar Falls. The newspaper told her his name. It came the second day, the Cedar Falls Tribune, thin and local, with the whole thing on the front page above a photograph of the crossing. She had not wanted to read it and could not stop herself. 5 children saved, the headline said, and beneath it smaller, 1 dead. And there, in the 3rd paragraph, was the thing she had been both dreading and needing: Thomas Brennan, 58, a section hand who had maintained the Sawkill line for 31 years, survived by a son, a widower. The paper said he had been checking a reported fault on the spur, alone, as he had done 1,000 winter afternoons, and had not heard the train. Ruth read the name 3 times. Thomas Brennan. It was an ordinary name, a name like 100 names she had written at the top of report cards over 40 years. And now it belonged to a man she had sent a freight train onto. She found she could not hold the abstraction the law would later try to make of him. He was not one life. He was a man of 58 who had gotten up that morning and put on an orange coat and gone out to a cold rail because it was his job. And he had a son somewhere who was, at that very hour, learning to live in a world without his father. And then, unbidden, the grief opened a door it had no business opening, and Walter walked through it. It was the word widower that did it, she thought afterward. Thomas Brennan had buried a wife, the paper said, and the word reached into Ruth and turned a key she had kept rusted shut for 4 years. Because she had been there in the worst sense. She had been in the room. Walter had complained of his arm at supper, and she had told him it was the cold, the way you tell the people you love the small, comfortable lies. And she had cleared the plates. He had gone gray over the sink an hour later, and she had called for help. And she had knelt on the kitchen floor and tried to remember what the man at the church first aid class had shown them. The rhythm of it, the count, and her hands had been old and uncertain, and his chest had not answered them. The ambulance had come from 11 miles away. It was not her fault. Everyone had told her. The doctors, the minister, Diane on the phone in a voice gone strange and far, that it was not her fault, that no one could have done more. She had never once believed them. That was the thing no one understood. For 4 years, Ruth had carried the quiet, unspeakable certainty that when the one life she had been given to save lay on the floor in front of her, her hands had not been enough, and now on a bridge in 5 seconds. Those same hands had reached out and saved 5 strangers' children, and the price of it had been a man named Thomas Brennan, 58, a widower, survived by a son. She did not know what to do with a justice that arbitrary. She sat with the newspaper until the lamp grew pale against the dawn. It was near the end of that long, sleepless reckoning, when the gray light had finally crept across the kitchen floor, that she heard the small sound at the front door, the soft scrape and drop of something pushed through the mail slot onto the mat. It was too early for the post. The street outside was empty, the snow on the walk unbroken, except for a single set of footprints that came to her door and turned and went away. On the mat lay a single white envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just her name, Ruth Callahan, in hard black capitals pressed so deep into the paper that she could feel the letters from the back, as though whoever wrote them had wanted to score the name rather than simply set it down. Her hands, the hands that had failed Walter and saved the children and sent Thomas Brennan onto the spur, were not quite steady as she bent, slowly, and picked it up. She carried the envelope to the kitchen table, the way one carries something that might still be alive, and sat with it a long while before she could open it. The capitals of her name were pressed so hard the paper had nearly torn. When she worked her thumb under the flap, a single sheet came out, folded once, and on it, in the same merciless black hand, were 5 words. "You had no right, murderer." Ruth set the page down carefully. She did not weep. She had taught children long enough to know the difference between cruelty and pain. And there was pain in those hard-pressed letters, a grief that had nowhere to go and so had come, across the snow, to the one door it could blame. She did not know whose grief it was, but she recognized its shape, because she had carried its twin for 4 years. She put the letter in the drawer of the hall table and tried to forget it, which is a bargain the heart makes and the mind never honors. All that day she felt the drawer at her back like a sound she could not place. The second letter came 4 days later. pushed through the slot before dawn, the footprints in the snow again, single, again turning back at her step. This one did not call her a murderer. It was worse, because it was specific. He had a wife once, it said of the man on the tracks, and a boy who is grown now and has no one left. You will sleep in a warm house tonight. He sleeps under the ground at St. Bridget's because you decided he was worth less than 5 strangers. Ruth read it twice, then scraped her untouched supper into the bin and stood at the dark window a long time. The third came the following week. By then the town had begun, in its quiet Cedar Falls way, to take its private measure of her. No one said a word. It was subtler than words. It was the cashier who counted her change onto the counter, rather than into her open palm. It was the way 2 women at the church bent to a hymnal, just as she passed. The letter only said aloud what the averted eyes had already begun to murmur. They are calling you a hero, it read. Let them. I know what you are, and in the end, so will you. There was no signature. There was never a signature, only that same hand, which seemed to Ruth to be growing not angrier, but more tired, the way her own grief had grown tired, settling from a fire into a long gray ache that never flared and never left. It was the 4th letter that truly frightened her, and not because of any threat. It came on a night of hard wind off the river, and when she unfolded it, her hands went still. You stood at the eastern end of the bridge, it said. Your right hand was on the switch. You wore a blue scarf at your throat. You were not as alone up there as you believed. Ruth read the line about the scarf 3 times, and the warm kitchen seemed to tilt slowly around her. No one knew about the scarf. It had not been in the newspaper. She had not told the deputy, nor the gray-mustached officer, nor a living soul, that Walter's blue scarf had been knotted at her throat on the bridge, because it had not seemed to matter to anyone but her. It was hers, a private warmth she had carried, without thinking, into the worst 5 seconds of her life. And yet someone knew. Someone had stood close enough on that white afternoon to mark the one spot of color at an old woman's throat through the driving snow, which meant the writer had been there, on the bridge, or near it, in the trees, had watched what she did with their own eyes, and the thought that crept in behind that one and would not leave was colder than any threat. If a stranger in the snow had seen the blue of her scarf, what else might they have seen? Had they seen the man in the orange coat lift his head? Had they seen the nod? The small, tired nod she could no longer swear had ever happened. Was there, somewhere in the dark of Cedar Falls, a person who held the truth of that single second more surely than she held it herself? She did not sleep. She spread all 4 letters before her like the pages of a terrible report card she was being made to grade on herself, and understood at last that she was no longer haunted by only one thing. She was haunted by what her hands had done. But now she was haunted, too, by what she could not be certain her eyes had seen. And over the long hours of that night the 2 hauntings had begun, without her permission, to braid themselves into a single tightening rope. Near 3 a.m, she went to the window. The street lay white and unbroken. The snow on her walk healed over, as though no one had ever stood there. At the far end of Maple Street, the frozen footbridge was a faint dark seam, against a darker sky. The blue scarf hung on its hook beside the door, and Ruth stood looking at it and found, to her own quiet horror, that she could not bring herself to touch it. Behind her, the 4 letters waited in the lamplight. The unsent letter to Diane waited on the sill, and the percolator stood cold and patient, ready as ever to brew, as it always did, for 2. In the weeks after the 4th letter, Cedar Falls did not turn on Ruth all at once. It would have been easier, almost a mercy, if it had. Instead, the town withdrew from her by degrees, the way the river drew back from the banks each winter, leaving more and more cold gray stone exposed where the water had once been. She felt it first at the bank on Main Street. She had gone in to deposit her pension check, the small monthly sum that was all the state thought 40 years of teaching other people's children was worth, and the young clerk who had once called her Mrs. Callahan and asked after her garden now slid the receipt across the counter without meeting her eyes. Behind her in line, a man she had taught to read in the 3rd grade studied the ceiling tiles. No one was cruel. That was the thing. Cruelty, she could have answered. This was worse. A soft general agreement to look slightly past her, as though she had become a draft in the room, a cold place people stepped around without quite knowing why. She felt it at the church on Sunday, the church where she had arranged the flowers for 30 years and had buried Walter from the front pew. She took her usual place, and the family beside her gathered their coats and moved, with apologetic murmurs, 3 rows back. During the passing of the peace, hands that had clasped hers warmly all her life found other hands to clasp. The minister preached on judgment and mercy and did not once look in her direction, which told her he had been thinking of her the whole time. She told herself it did not matter. She had been alone for 4 years already. She had grown a callous over that particular wound. But there is a difference between the loneliness you choose and the loneliness a town hands you, and Ruth was learning it the hard way, in the averted glance and the suddenly busy hand, and some nights the unfairness of it rose in her like heat, that she had saved 5 children and was being made to pay as though she had drowned them. It was in the middle of that long gray stretch that the other thing began. She had gone to the stove to make her single cup of tea, and she stood there a moment, kettle in hand, and could not for the life of her remember whether she had already filled it. She set it down and picked it up and set it down again, and the small confusion frightened her more than any letter had. Then, a few days later, the dizziness. She was reaching for a book on the high shelf, the one Walter had built, and the room slid sideways, and the floor tipped up toward her, and she had to grip the shelf and stand very still until Cedar Falls settled back into its proper shape around her. She blamed the cold. She blamed the sleeplessness, the letters, the strain of being looked past in her own town. She had reasons enough, and grief was reason enough for anything. But late one evening, she went to write down the date of a follow-up the hospital had scheduled after the bridge, and she stood with the pen over the calendar and could not summon the month, not for several seconds. December. It was December. It came back to her, but the gap where it had been stayed open, a small dark window onto something she did not want to see. That night she sat at the kitchen table and made herself think, clearly, the way she had once taught children to lay a problem out in plain steps. The forgetting, the dizziness, the word that would not come on the bridge when the deputy asked her name, and underneath all of it, the question the fourth letter had pried open and left ajar. How much of what she remembered could she trust? She had been so certain of the nod. She was less certain now. And if her mind could lose a kettle, a month, her own name in the cold, then what was the worth of her certainty about a single second on a bridge, with snow falling and her old eyes full of tears? The two fears she had carried separately, the town's judgment and the failing of her own memory, leaned together in the lamplight and became, for the first time, one fear with two faces. If she could not trust her mind, then she could not defend what she had done, even to herself. She would be alone not only in the town, but inside her own recollection, with no solid ground anywhere to stand on. She looked across the kitchen at the calendar with its open window of forgotten December, and at the drawer that held the letters, and at the blue scarf on its hook by the door. Then she did the only sensible thing left, the thing she had been avoiding for weeks because she was afraid of the answer. She picked up the telephone, the one that almost never rang, and in a voice that she kept steady by an act of will, she made an appointment to see the doctor about her memory. When she hung up, the house was very quiet, and the snow had begun again outside, falling soft and patient on Maple Street, on the bank and the church and the silent bridge, covering the whole watchful town in white. And Ruth sat alone in the lamplight, and was more afraid of what was inside her head than of anything anyone could push through her door. The clinic sat at the edge of Cedar Falls, a low brick building behind the old feed store, and Ruth arrived 20 minutes early because she had stopped trusting herself to judge time. She sat in the waiting room with her gloves folded in her lap and the blue scarf at her throat, and she watched the snow slide down the window in long gray ribbons, and she rehearsed the way she had once rehearsed lessons, the things she meant to say so that none of them would slip away from her in the room. Dr. Patel was younger than Ruth had expected, a soft-spoken woman with kind, unhurried eyes, and she did not rush. She let Ruth tell it in her own order, the kettle she could not remember filling, the room that had tipped sideways at the bookshelf Walter built, the month that would not come when she stood with the pen over the calendar, and, though it cost her something to say it aloud to a stranger, the way her own name had hidden from her on the bridge, in the cold, when the young deputy had asked her who she was. The doctor wrote little. She mostly listened, which Ruth had not expected, and which undid her more than questions would have. Then she set down her pen and said they would do a few simple things, nothing to be afraid of, just to see how the memory was working. They were such small tasks. That was the cruelty of them. The doctor named 3 words and asked Ruth to hold them and give them back in a few minutes. And Ruth, who had held the names of 40 years of children, who could still recite the roll of her first class in 1963, gave back 2 of the 3 and felt the missing word vanish into the dark like a coin dropped into deep water. The doctor asked her to count backward from 100 by sevens. 93, 86. And then the numbers, which had always come to Ruth as easily as breathing, simply scattered, and she sat there with her hands tightening in her lap while the snow came down outside. "It's all right," the doctor said gently, when Ruth's eyes filled. "These tests are not the whole of you, Mrs. Callahan. They are only a window." There were scans after that, on another day, the great machine humming around her head like a hive. And then there was a third day, the worst day, when Ruth sat again across the desk from Dr. Patel and watched the woman's kind face arrange itself for difficult news, and knew before a word was spoken what kind of word it would be. The doctor was honest because Ruth had asked her to be. There were changes in the brain, she said, the slow kind, the kind that did not turn back. They had a name for it, and the name did not matter much. What mattered was what it did. It would take the small things first, the kettles and the months and the names. It would take her judgment by degrees. So quietly she might not notice it going. And in time, the doctor said, choosing her words with great care, in time it would reach back and begin to take the past as well, the way a tide does not only cover the sand ahead of it, but pulls back what lies behind. Ruth sat very still. Outside, Cedar Falls lay under its endless white. "The past," she said. It was not quite a question. "Memories you think are fixed," the doctor said softly. "The good ones, the hard ones. I won't pretend otherwise. It is kinder to know." And that was when Ruth understood the true shape of the thing that had been coming for her. And it was not the loss of kettles or months. It was Walter. It was the way he had laughed with his whole face. It was the warm weight of newborn Diane in the crook of her arm in the hospital all those years ago. It was every small good thing she had been hoarding against the loneliness. And one day, this illness would walk through the rooms of her memory, turning out the lamps one by one, and she would not even know they had gone dark. But there was something worse still, and Ruth made herself look directly at it there in the quiet office, because she had spent a lifetime telling children that the only way past a hard thing was through it. If the disease could reach back and take the past, then it could take or twist, or quietly rewrite the one memory she most needed to keep whole, the bridge, the orange coat, the man who had looked up, and the nod, the small tired nod she thought he had given her, the only scrap of mercy she had carried out of that terrible afternoon. She had already doubted it because of the snow and her tears and the distance. Now she had to doubt it for a colder reason, because the very instrument she would use to remember it, her own mind, had just been declared unreliable, a witness the court of her own conscience could no longer fully trust. She thanked the doctor. She did not cry until she reached the car. She sat in the cold front seat in the clinic lot with the snow gathering on the windshield, sealing her slowly into a small white quiet. And she pressed Walter's blue scarf to her face and breathed in the faint cedar smell of it, as though by holding on hard enough she could keep even one thing from being taken. Then she started the engine and drove home through the falling snow, past the bank and the church and the silent bridge, alone with the town that looked past her and a mind that was, she now knew, beginning to look past her too, and somewhere ahead of her in the dark, she could not yet see how soon. A knock was waiting at her door. The house was waiting for her exactly as she had left it, and that was somehow the hardest part. The doctor had said the word that could not be taken back, and the world had not rearranged itself to match. The kettle still sat on the cold stove. The percolator still stood ready to brew for two. The blue scarf still hung on its hook by the door. Everything was where it had always been, and only Ruth had changed, carrying now inside her skull a slow tide that would, in its own time, come for all of it. She did not turn on the lamps. She sat at the kitchen table in the failing afternoon light and let the dark gather in the corners of the room, and she began, against every wish, to do the things she had been dreading since the clinic. She began to test her own memory of the bridge. She closed her eyes and went back. The cold iron of the switch under her glove, the yellow bus sliding, the freight horn, the long groan of the rusted lever giving way. All of that was solid, she told herself. All of that she could stand on. And then the spur, the bare birches, the man in the orange coat bent over the rail. That too she could see. But here the ground grew soft. Had his coat been orange, or had the newspaper told her orange and her mind quietly painted it in afterward? Had he held a long-handled tool? Or had she built the tool from the kind of man he must have been? She pressed harder, the way you press a bruise to be sure it is still there. And the harder she pressed, the more the picture seemed to shift under her, like a reflection on water troubled by a hand. And the nod, that was the thing she had come home to interrogate. The small tired nod, the one mercy, the single moment in which a dying man had seemed to tell her that he understood, that he did not blame her, that what she had done was a terrible thing done for a reason he could forgive. She had carried that nod through every sleepless night and every averted glance in town. It was the thread she had been holding over the dark. And now she sat in her cold kitchen and asked herself, plainly, the way Dr. Patel had taught her to be plain, did it happen? She could not say. That was the horror of it. She could not say. Perhaps he had nodded, or perhaps a frightened, grieving, 67-year-old woman standing on a bridge with the worst of her life unfolding below her, had needed so badly to be forgiven that her own mind had reached down through the snow and made the nod for her, had drawn it the way a lonely person draws a face in the clouds. And now that same mind had been declared a poor witness, a thing that lost kettles and months and the names of its own children, and she had no way left to check it against anything outside herself. There was no one to ask. The only other soul who knew the truth of that second was under the ground at St. Bridget's, in the cold she had sent him to. She got up and walked through the dark house, restless, her torn shoulder aching, and she found herself standing in the doorway of the spare room that had once been Diane's, looking at the narrow bed, at the faded paper on the walls. She thought of all the things she had been so sure of across the years that had turned out, on examination, to be half made by her own wanting. She had been sure Walter would have more time. She had been sure Diane would call. Certainty, she saw now, had always been a kind of comfort she granted herself, and the disease was only doing openly what grief and hope had been doing quietly all along, bending what was true into the shape she could bear. So which was the nod a mercy that had really happened, or a mercy she had given herself because she could not have survived the alternative. She did not sleep. Near midnight, she took out the photograph of Thomas Brennan she had torn from the newspaper, the squinting man in the railway coat, and she set it on the table in the lamplight and looked at it a long time, as though his fixed paper face might settle what her moving memory could not. It told her nothing. A man squinting into a long-gone sun. She understood, sitting there, that she would never have proof, that she would have to live the rest of her shrinking memory carrying a question with no floor under it, and that whatever she finally chose to believe about that nod would be, in the end, a choice, an act of faith and not of evidence. She was still sitting there, the photograph before her, and the question turning and turning with nowhere to land, when the first gray light came once again to the kitchen window, and Cedar Falls woke around her, cold and watchful and unforgiving. And then, into that thin morning, came a sound she had not heard in weeks, not the soft, secret scrape of an envelope through the slot before dawn. This was different. This was loud and certain and unashamed of itself, a sound that wanted the whole street to hear it, a firm, official knock at her front door. For a long moment, Ruth did not move. She sat at the kitchen table with the torn newspaper photograph of Thomas Brennan still before her, and the gray dawn pressing at the window. And she listened to the knock come again, firm and unhurried. And she understood that whatever stood on the other side of that door had not come in the dark and would not turn back in the snow. The letters had always been a thing of shadows, slipped through the slot before light, ashamed of themselves. This was something else. This had come in the open, in daylight, to be seen. She rose, smoothed her skirt with hands that were not quite steady, and went down the hall. Through the frosted glass she could make out a shape, a man in a heavy coat, and beside him the long, pale rectangle of an envelope held ready. She unlatched the door. He was middle-aged, polite, a little tired, the way men get who carry bad news for a living. He asked in a flat, careful voice whether she was Ruth Callahan, and when she said that she was, he held out the envelope and told her she had been served, and that it was all in the papers, and that he was sorry, in the rote way of a man who says it 20 times a week and means it each time a little less and a little more. Then he touched the brim of his hat and went back down the shoveled walk to a car idling at the curb, and the cold came in through the open door, and Ruth stood holding the thing in both hands. It was heavier than the anonymous letters had ever been, though it weighed almost nothing. The county seal was printed in the corner. Her name was typed, not scored in furious capitals, and somehow the very neatness of it was worse, the indifference of a machine that did not hate her, that had simply processed her into a case. She carried it to the kitchen, and she sat back down across from Thomas Brennan's photograph, and she opened it carefully, the way she opened everything now, as though sudden movement might let something escape. She did not understand all the words. There were a great many of them, and they marched down the page in cold columns. But the shape of the thing rose up out of the legal language clear enough. The state of the matter. The people. A charge. They were saying that on the 12th of December she had unlawfully caused the death of Thomas Brennan, a man of 58, and that the law required her to answer for it before a court. At the head of the page, in plain type, the matter had been given its name, the name by which the whole town would come to know that winter, the people versus Ruth Callahan. She read it twice. She waited for the terror to come, and some of it did, a cold, flat dread that spread out from her chest, because she was 67 and ill and alone, and a court could take from her the small handful of years she had left. But underneath the dread, to her own great surprise, there moved something she had not expected and was almost ashamed to name. It felt faintly like relief. For weeks she had been the only judge in her own case, sitting alone at this table in the lamplight, prosecuting and defending herself and reaching no verdict that would hold. She had no one to tell her whether what she had done was right or monstrous. The town looked past her. Her own mind had been declared an unreliable witness. And here, now, was a court. A room with a judge and rules and 12 strangers who would weigh the things she could not weigh herself, who would say at the end of it, guilty or not guilty, and give her at last an answer from somewhere outside her own failing head. It was a terrible kind of comfort, but it was a kind. The relief did not last. Hard on its heels came the cold that mattered, the one that reached all the way down, because a court would not want her grief or her sleepless nights. A court would want her testimony. It would put her under oath and ask her to say, plainly and truly, exactly what had happened on that bridge. And how could she swear to a memory she no longer trusted? How could she raise her hand and promise to tell the truth, when the truth she most needed, the man looking up, the small, tired nod, the one mercy, had become a thing she could no longer be sure she had seen and not merely needed to see? She would stand in that room and be asked for certainty, and she had none. The disease had taken it, or grief had. She no longer knew the difference. She set the summons down beside Thomas Brennan's photograph, the neat typed name beside the squinting paper face, the accusation and the accused laid side by side on her kitchen table in the cold morning light. Then she rose and went to the door and lifted Walter's blue scarf from its hook and held it a moment against her cheek, breathing the faint cedar of it. She had been afraid to touch it for weeks. Now she wound it slowly around her throat, because if she was to be dragged into the open at last, into a courtroom and the eyes of the whole town, she did not intend to go without the one warm thing she had left of the life before all this. Outside, Cedar Falls lay white and waiting under a sky the color of old iron, and at the far end of Maple Street the bridge stood frozen and silent, and Ruth Callahan stood in her doorway with a summons in her hand and a dead man's name on the page, and understood that the quiet private war of her conscience was about to become a public trial, and that there would be no hiding from any of it now. The summons sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before David Okafor knocked on the door of the house on Maple Street. He was younger than Ruth had expected, perhaps 32, with a worn leather satchel and a coat too thin for a Cedar Falls winter. And when she opened the door, he introduced himself twice, as though he were not yet certain anyone would trust a man his age with a thing this large. She gave him coffee. The percolator still brewed for two, and she had learned, since the bridge, to stop pouring the second cup down the sink. He sat at her table with the snow melting off his shoes and laid the charging document between them, like something that might bite. "Manslaughter," he said. "Second degree. The district attorney is calling it reckless. Mrs. Callahan, they're arguing you made a deliberate choice that ended a man's life, and that the law cannot excuse it simply because other lives were spared." He turned the paper so she could read it, though she did not. "I won't lie to you. The law cares about what you did and what it caused. It does not care, in the way you might hope, about what was in your heart." Ruth folded her hands. Through the window, the blue scarf lay on the sill, where it always lay, and beside it, the unsent letter to Diane, 11 days old now and gathering its own quiet weight. Then why would a man your age take a case that the law is already against? For a moment, Okafor said nothing. He looked at the coffee instead of at her, and something passed over his face that she recognized, because she had worn it herself for 4 months. "My father drove a freight line for 26 years, he said at last, "out of Scranton. When I was 14, a coupling failed and a car came loose, and he had 4 seconds to choose whether to throw the brake and derail the train into a yard where men were working, or let it run into the back of a stopped passenger car ahead." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. He chose the yard. 2 men were hurt. None died, by the grace of God. But the company ruled it his error, and he never worked a line again. And he spent the rest of his life in a chair by the window arguing with a jury that existed only in his head. He looked up. "I became a lawyer because nobody ever let my father say his piece out loud. So when I read about a schoolteacher on a bridge with 5 seconds and a lever, Mrs. Callahan, I drove here before anyone else could take the case." Ruth was quiet. She had braced herself for a stranger handling her life like paperwork, and instead she had been handed a man carrying his own bridge, his own 4 seconds, his own father in a chair by a window. The kitchen felt suddenly less lonely and somehow more dangerous, because now there were 2 of them who needed this to mean something. "There is a defense," Okafor went on, steadier now, professional again. "Necessity. We argue that the harm you prevented was so much greater than the harm you caused that the law itself must bend. It has worked before. It has also failed before. Badly. In front of juries who decide that no one has the right to choose who lives." He set the paper flat. "But to run it, I need to know exactly what happened on that bridge. Every second, including the parts you haven't told the police." She told him. The cold lever, the yellow bus, the long whine of the tires on ice, the freight horn, the orange coat below. She told it carefully and completely, the way she had once taught children to give an account of themselves, leaving out only one thing. She did not tell him about the nod. She could not, because she no longer trusted that it had happened, and a woman who could not trust her own memory had no business swearing to it in a courtroom. When she finished, Okafor wrote nothing for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook and folded his hands the way she had folded hers, and he asked the question she had been dreading since the day she pulled the lever, the question her own daughter had not called to ask, the question the whole town whispered behind her back. Mrs. Callahan, when you pulled that lever, when you understood in that second what it would cost, do you believe you did the right thing? Ruth looked at the blue scarf on the sill. She thought of Walter, gone 4 years, and of the second cup she no longer poured away, and of a young man across her table carrying his father like a stone. She did not say, "I don't know," though it was the truth, because she understood now that it was not the answer that mattered, but whether she was willing to stop hiding behind it. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I would do it again, and I believe it would haunt me again. I have stopped expecting those two things to cancel each other out." She met his eyes. "If that's not enough for your defense, Mr. Okafor, then we are both going to lose. But it's the only true thing I have, and I won't dress it up to please a jury." Okafor looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since he had knocked on her door, he smiled, tired and certain. "It's enough," he said. "Honesty is the only thing a frightened jury ever really believes." He gathered his thin coat. "Get some sleep. Mrs. Callahan, the trial begins Monday, and they will try to make you into either a hero or a murderer. Our whole task is to keep you a human being." When he had gone, Ruth stood at the window a long while. The snow had stopped. The scarf was blue against the white sill, and the letter to Diane lay beside it. And for the first time she let herself wonder whether her daughter would read about the trial in some distant paper, and whether, somewhere 1,100 miles away, she would care. Ruth did not sleep. She had not expected to. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, and the house was so quiet she could hear the refrigerator hum and the small ticks of the old clock in the hall, the one Walter had wound every Sunday for 31 years, and that she now wound badly, always a day late. She had thought, when Okafor left, that she would spend the night rehearsing what she would say. Instead, she found herself doing something stranger. She got out the box from the hall closet, the one she had not opened since the funeral, and she sat on the cold floor in her nightgown and looked at the things inside it. Walter's reading glasses, a church program from a wedding neither of them could now remember, a photograph of Diane at 7, gap-toothed, holding a paper crown Ruth had made her for a school play, looking up at the camera as if the woman behind it had hung the moon. Ruth held the photograph a long time. She had taught for 40 years. She had stood in front of more children than she could count and told them, in 100 small ways, that their choices mattered, that there was a right thing and a wrong thing, and the courage was in knowing the difference. She had believed it. She had believed it the way you believe the floor will hold you, without ever once thinking about the floor. And then there had been 5 seconds on a bridge, and the floor had not held. She did not try, that night, to decide whether she had done right. She had stopped believing the word was even shaped to fit what had happened. There had been a bus full of children she could see and a man she could barely make out. And there had been a lever cold enough to burn. And there had been her own 2 hands. That was all there had ever been. The philosophers could argue about the arithmetic of it. She had not been doing arithmetic. She had been a frightened woman trying to keep as many people alive as her hands could reach. What kept her on the floor until the lamp burned low was not the question of right. It was a smaller, sharper thing. She kept seeing the children as people. Samuel, who she had heard at the inquest, collected beetles in a jar by his bed. Rosa, somewhere out there, 9 years old then and grown now into a girl Ruth had not yet met. She let herself imagine them whole, with futures, with mornings. And then, because honesty demanded it, she made herself do the same for the man, Thomas. She did not know his face, but he had 31 years on that line, the same number of years Walter had wound the clock, and that small coincidence undid her more than any argument could have. Near 3 a.m, she put the photograph back. She did not put the box away. She left it open on the floor, because she had decided she was finished closing things and pretending they were settled. Then she did the thing she had been circling all night. She took the unsent letter to Diane from the windowsill, 11 days written and never mailed, and she read it through once. It was a poor letter. It said too little and apologized for the wrong things. She tore it in half, and then in half again, and she dropped the pieces in the bin, and she felt no grief at all, only a clean tiredness, because she had already decided that a letter was not what she owed her daughter. What she owed her daughter was a voice. That would come later, if there was a later. Tonight she had a trial to walk into. When the first gray light came to the window, Ruth rose and washed her face and dressed with care. She chose the navy coat she had last worn to bury Walter, because it was the most serious thing she owned, and because some part of her felt she was going to mourn something today, though she could not have said what. At the door she paused. The blue scarf hung on its hook. She lifted it, turned it once in her hands, and wound it slowly around her throat. It still smelled faintly of the cedar chest. It was the only warmth she would take with her into that cold brick building, the only thing of Walter's that could go where she was going. She did not pray for the verdict. She had given up bargaining with God somewhere around the second anonymous letter. She prayed instead, briefly, with her hand on the cold doorknob, the only prayer she had left, which was simply, "Let me tell the truth, and let it be enough." Outside, Cedar Falls was white and silent. The footbridge over the Sawkill stood frozen at the end of the street, the iron switch invisible under snow, and Ruth did not look at it. She got into her old car, and her hands were steady on the wheel, steadier than they had been since December, because a person who has stopped lying to herself has very little left to fear. She drove toward the courthouse with the blue scarf at her throat, and the box still open on the kitchen floor behind her, and she was not certain of anything except this, that whatever happened in that room, she would walk into it as herself, an ordinary woman who had done an extraordinary and terrible thing, and would not let them turn her into anything smaller or larger than that. The courthouse in Cedar Falls was a square brick building from another century, with tall windows that let in the cold, and a radiator that knocked all morning like a fist on a pipe. Ruth sat at the defense table beside David Okafor in her navy coat, the blue scarf still wound at her throat, and she made herself look at the room the way she had once made herself look at a class on the first hard day of a year, steadily, without flinching. The gallery was full. She knew nearly every face. There was Mrs. Abernathy from the church, and the young pharmacist, and the men who drank coffee at the diner on Main, and they had all come, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of that terrible human hunger to see how a thing turns out. And in the second row, behind the prosecution, sat the Brennan family, the widow, gray and straight-backed in black, and beside her, a young man of perhaps 30, Thomas Brennan's son, who looked at Ruth once and then did not look again, his jaw set like a man holding a door shut against a wind. Ruth made herself look at them too. She had decided, somewhere in the night, that she would not spend this trial pretending the dead man was an abstraction. She owed the widow her gaze, even if she could not yet offer her anything more. The prosecutor rose. Caroline Voss was a woman of about 50, precise, gray-suited, with the kind of stillness that made a room go quiet without her raising her voice. She did not begin with theatrics. She began with a photograph, which she set on an easel facing the jury, a man in his 50s in a railway coat, squinting into the sun, one arm around a boy of 10. This was Thomas Brennan, she said. He worked the Sawkill line for 31 years. He was a father. He was a widower's son who cared for his own mother until she died. On the afternoon of December the 12th, he went to work as he had gone to work for 3 decades, and he did not come home because the defendant, Ruth Callahan, made a decision that he should not. She let the silence sit. The radiator knocked. You will hear the defense tell you that Mrs. Callahan saved 5 children. That is true. I will not stand here and pretend those children do not matter, or that what she faced was not terrible. Voss turned and looked directly at Ruth, and there was no hatred in her face, which was somehow worse than hatred. But I am going to ask you to hold to something difficult. The law does not let any of us decide, in 5 seconds or 50 years, that one human life is worth less than 5. The moment we permit a private citizen to waste souls and act on the sum, we have lost the only thing that protects the weak from the strong, the one from the many, your life and mine from someone who has decided we are worth less than the people standing behind us. It was not a slogan. Ruth had braced herself for a slogan, and instead, the woman had said something Ruth herself half believed, and the courtroom felt the weight of it settle. Then Voss did a thing Ruth had not expected. She set down her notes and spoke more quietly, almost as if only to the jury and not to the gallery at all. I'll tell you why I took this case, since you'll wonder. Many years ago, a doctor decided my younger sister was not a good use of a scarce medicine. She was 16. There were others, he judged, more likely to recover. He weighed her, and he was probably even right by the arithmetic. And she died on a Tuesday in a hospital that had run the numbers. She smoothed her notes flat. I am not here because I hate Mrs. Callahan. I am sure she is a decent woman. I am here because I have spent 30 years watching what happens to the ones who get weighed and found wanting. And I will not let a courtroom teach this town that it is permitted. She sat down. The room was utterly still. Okafor did not move beside Ruth, and Ruth understood, with a cold clarity, that they had not been handed a villain to defeat. They had been handed a grieving, principled woman who had turned her own loss into a wall, and who was not wrong, and who could not be made to seem wrong, only answered with something equally human. Ruth looked down at her own hands on the table, the same hands that had been on the lever. She thought of the photograph of Thomas Brennan with his arm around a boy of 10, and of Voss's sister, 16, dying on a Tuesday because someone had run the numbers. The arithmetic she had refused to do on the bridge sat now in the middle of the courtroom, demanding she answer for it, and she had no answer that would not also be a wound. The judge, a heavy man with reading glasses pushed down his nose, turned to the defense. "Mr. Okafor, your opening." Okafor rose. He buttoned his thin coat, and for a moment Ruth saw not the lawyer, but the boy from Scranton whose father had sat by a window, arguing with a jury that did not exist. And she understood that he was about to argue for that father too. "The prosecution," he began, "has told you that no one may weigh a life. She is right." He paused. And yet, on the 12th of December, a beast full of children was sliding toward a freight train, and someone had to, not because Ruth Callahan believed herself wise enough to judge who should live, because there was a lever under her hand and 4 seconds on the clock, and the only choice the universe offered her that afternoon was which grief she would have to carry home. Ruth felt her eyes sting. She kept them on her hands. The blue scarf was warm at her throat, the only warmth in that cold brick room, and somewhere outside, frozen at the end of Maple Street, the bridge waited under its snow. Okafor did not call experts first. He called mothers. Teresa Delgado took the stand in a coat she had clearly bought for the occasion, her hands twisting in her lap. And when Okafor asked her to tell the jury about her daughter, she could not speak for a moment. Then she said that Rosa had been on that bus, 9 years old, in the 3rd seat from the front, and that she was alive now, 16, and that she did not have words for what it meant to still have a child to argue with about curfews. She looked at Ruth when she said it. She did not look at the Brennan family, and Ruth saw the widow's hands tighten in her black lap, and understood that every mother's gratitude in this room was, to that grieving woman, another small stone laid on her husband's grave. That was the thing the trial kept teaching Ruth. There was no testimony that helped one side without wounding the other. A grandfather spoke next, a man who had raised the boy across the road after the parents left, and he was angry in the way of men who do not know what to do with grief. And he said he did not care about philosophy. He cared that the child was still breathing. And he sat down before Okafor could finish thanking him. Then Okafor called Samuel. The boy was 9, small for his age, in a sweater his mother had clearly fought him into. He sat in the witness chair with his feet not reaching the floor, and answered the first easy questions in a voice almost too quiet for the microphone. Yes, he had been on the bus. Yes. He remembered the bus going sideways. Yes, he was okay now. Okay, crouched a little so he was not towering. Samuel, do you understand why we're all here today? The boy nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again, the way children do when they have heard the grown-up version and the true version and cannot make them fit. My mom said a lady got in trouble for saving us. He looked around the room, at the flags and the high windows and the gray man behind the bench, plainly frightened of all of it. His eyes found Ruth. Is it her? It is, Okafor said gently. Samuel looked at Ruth for a long moment. Then he said the thing that no lawyer could have scripted, because it was too simple and too crooked to be invented. A man died, so I could be here. He frowned, working at it. I didn't know him. I feel bad that I don't even know his name, but I'm going to learn it. He looked at the judge, suddenly worried he had said something wrong. Is that okay to learn his name? The courtroom was very quiet. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman made a sound into a handkerchief. It was not a speech. It mended nothing. A child had simply said, in front of everyone, that he was sorry he did not know the name of the man who died for him, and that he meant to learn it. And the rawness of it was worth more than any argument Okafor could have built, precisely because it claimed nothing. The boy was not declaring his life worth a man's. He was only refusing to let the man become a number. Ruth glanced, before she could stop herself, at the Brennan family. The widow had pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. And the son, the young man who had set his jaw like a man holding a door against the wind, had let the door open just a crack. He was looking at Samuel with an expression Ruth could not name, something between fury and a terrible hope. The look of a man who has spent 4 months wanting his father, remembered as a man, and has just heard a 9-year-old promise to do it. Then, abruptly, he rose. He did not shout. He simply gathered his coat and walked the length of the aisle and out the tall doors, and they swung shut behind him with a sound like a held breath let go. The judge called a recess. In the cold corridor, Okafor spoke low to Ruth. That was the best moment we could have hoped for, and the most dangerous. Ruth asked what he meant. Voss isn't wrong that no one should weigh a life. The boy just showed the jury something truer than the weighing. He showed them the man counts, and the children count, and that there was never a clean way through it. He rubbed his tired eyes. Juries forgive people they've seen be human. They convict numbers. Today they saw a boy promise to learn a dead man's name. I don't know if it saves you, Mrs. Callahan, but it made the room remember that everyone in this is a person, even you. Ruth said nothing. She was thinking of the son's face, that crack in the held-shut door, and of Thomas Brennan, who she still imagined only as an orange coat below a bridge, but who had, somewhere, taught his boy to set his jaw and stand his ground, and had been a man worth a 9-year-old learning his name. She wound the blue scarf tighter and looked out the frosted corridor window. Snow was beginning again over Cedar Falls, falling on the roofs and the diner and the frozen footbridge at the end of Maple Street. She did not know what the jury would decide. She knew only that something in the room had shifted, that the man on the tracks was no longer a number to anyone present, and that whatever the verdict, the trial had already done the one thing she had not dared to hope for. It had given Thomas Brennan back his name. The jury was out for 2 days. Okafor had warned her not to read the clock, that a long deliberation meant nothing or everything, that juries argued about lunch as fiercely as about a man's life. But Ruth read it anyway, because there was nothing else to do. She sat in her kitchen on Maple Street with the percolator brewing for 2 out of stubborn habit, and she did not pour the second cup away, and she waited. She thought she would be afraid. Instead, she felt something stranger, a kind of suspended quiet, the way the air goes still before snow. The trial had already given her the thing she had not known she needed. A boy had promised to learn a dead man's name. Whatever 12 strangers decided in a back room, that could not be taken back. On the evening of the first day, the telephone rang. Ruth nearly did not answer it. It rang so rarely now that the sound was almost an alarm. But she crossed the kitchen and lifted it, and there was a long pause on the line, and breathing. And then a voice she had not heard in 3 years said, uncertainly, "Mom, I saw it. In the paper. The Tribune ran the whole thing. A swallow. Are you all right?" Ruth held the phone against the cold wall and could not, for a moment, speak. Diane, 1,100 miles away, reading about her mother's trial in a city paper, calling the number she had not called since the second Christmas after Walter died. "I'm all right," Ruth managed. It was not true, and they both knew it. "I'm waiting on the jury." "I know." A pause. "I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me." "I have wanted to hear from you," Ruth said, "every single day." And the honesty of it surprised them both into silence. They did not fix anything that night. 3 years did not undo in one phone call, but Diane stayed on the line for almost an hour, and they talked about small things, the cold, the garden, whether Ruth was eating. And when they hung up, Ruth sat a long while with her hand still on the receiver, and the second cup of coffee had gone cold beside her, and for once she did not mind. On the afternoon of the second day, the bailiff called them back. The courtroom filled fast, the gallery rustling and tense. Every familiar face turned toward the door, where the jury would enter. The Brennan widow was in her usual place, straight-backed in black, but the son's seat beside her was empty, and Ruth felt the emptiness of it more sharply than any glare. He had not come back for the verdict. She did not know what that meant, and the not knowing sat in her like a stone. Caroline Voss stood at the prosecution table, still and gray, and Ruth caught her eye for half a second. There was no triumph in the woman's face, and no defeat, only the weariness of someone who had said her piece, for a sister dead on a Tuesday, and would have to live with whatever 12 strangers made of it. The jury filed in. None of them looked at Ruth, which Okafor had told her could mean anything. The judge asked the foreman if they had reached a verdict, and the foreman, a heavy man who worked at the feed store, said they had. "On the charge of manslaughter in the second degree, how do you find?" The foreman cleared his throat. The radiator knocked once into the silence. "Not guilty." The room exhaled. Somewhere behind her, a woman gave a small cry, and the judge tapped for order, and Teresa Delgado pressed both hands to her face. Ruth sat very still. She had expected, if this word came, to feel some great wave of relief lift her clear of the whole terrible winter. Instead, she felt only a quiet, complicated weight settle, because she understood, even as the gavel fell, that a verdict was not the same as a pardon, and that the law had told her she was not a criminal, but could not tell her whether she had been right, and never would. She turned and looked at the Brennan widow. The woman was gathering her black coat with hands that trembled, and for a moment their eyes met across the room. Ruth braced for hatred. What she saw instead was worse a tired, dignified nod, the nod of a woman who did not blame Ruth and could not forgive her either, who had simply understood, somewhere in 2 days of waiting, that the law had never been the right tool for what had happened on that bridge. Then the widow turned and walked out alone into the falling snow, and her son was not there to take her arm. Okafor exhaled beside Ruth and said, very low, "It's over." But Ruth knew it was not over, not the part that mattered. She wound the blue scarf at her throat and rose on unsteady legs, and the gallery parted for her the way crowds part for the famous and the cursed alike. At the top of the courthouse steps, she stopped. The snow had thickened. Cedar Falls lay white and hushed below her. The diner lights blurred, the frozen footbridge invisible at the end of the street, and there, at the bottom of the steps, hands buried in his coat, snow gathering on his shoulders as though he had been standing a long while, was Thomas Brennan's son, waiting for her. Okafor put a hand on her arm. "Mrs. Callahan, you don't have to. Let me walk you to the car. We can have a deputy see him off." Ruth looked down the snow-covered steps at the young man waiting at the bottom, and she thought of his empty seat during the verdict, and of the crack she had seen open in his face when a 9-year-old promised to learn his father's name. "No," she said. "He's been waiting a long time. The least I owe him is to let him say it." She went down slowly, one gloved hand on the cold iron rail, the blue scarf bright against the gray afternoon. The crowd had thinned and scattered into the snow, and by the time she reached the bottom, the two of them stood nearly alone, the courthouse looming behind her, the white street empty before them. Up close, he was younger than he had seemed across the courtroom, perhaps 30, with his father's heavy brow and a week of sleeplessness under his eyes. For a long moment he did not speak. Snow gathered on his shoulders. When the words came, they were quiet and shaking, with something held down hard. "They told me you got off. Not guilty." A short, bitter breath. "I knew they would. The whole town wanted to make you a hero." "I'm not a hero," Ruth said. "No." He looked at her then, full on. "You're the woman who killed my father and walked free." She did not flinch from it. She had decided, somewhere in the winter, that she would never again hide behind a softer word for what her hands had done. "Yes," she said, "I am." The plainness of it seemed to undo something in him. His jaw worked, And then, in a rush, as though a wall he had spent 4 months building gave way all at once, he said, "It was me. The letters. All of them. I'm the one who wrote them. I stood outside your house in the dark, and I watched your light, and I wanted you to be afraid the way I was afraid. I wanted you to lie awake, too." His voice cracked. "You took everything from me. Do you understand that I wrote those words because they were the only true thing I had left?" So there it was. The thing that had haunted Ruth through the worst nights of the winter, the footprints in the snow, the white envelopes, the line about the right-hand lover that only someone on the bridge could have known. Not a faceless enemy. A son. A boy of 30 grieving his father with the only weapons grief had given him. She did not call for the deputy. She stood very still in the falling snow and let him empty himself out. He wasn't a number, the son said, and now he was crying without seeming to know it, the way men cry who have not allowed themselves to in a long time. He worked that line 31 years. He raised me by himself after my mother got sick. He taught me to stand my ground and never let anyone make me small. And the paper called him the railway worker. The prosecutor called him one life, like he was just the smaller number in your arithmetic. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes. I sat in that courtroom for 2 days, and nobody knew him. And then a little boy stood up and said he was going to learn my father's name. And I had to leave, because it was the first time in 4 months anyone treated him like he mattered. "Samuel," Ruth said softly. "The boy's name is Samuel, and he meant it." The son laughed, a broken sound, and shook his head. "I came here to tell you I don't forgive you. I want you to hear that. I don't. Maybe I never will." He drew a steadying breath. "But I read his diary last week. He kept one his whole life. 31 years of it, and I read the last entries. And I think you should read them too." He reached into his coat and brought out an old leather book, worn soft at the corners, and held it out to her across the snow. "I don't know why I'm giving this to you. Maybe so you'll know who he was. Maybe so you'll never sleep easy again. I haven't decided." His hand did not waver. "Take it. Read it. Then send it back to me. It's all I have left of him, and I'm trusting you with it. God knows why." Ruth looked at the diary and at the young man's raw, exhausted face, and she understood that he was offering her something far harder than forgiveness. He was offering her the truth of the man she had killed and asking her to carry it. She took the book in both hands. It was heavier than it looked. "I won't tell you it'll be all right," she said. "I've stopped saying that to people, but I'll read every word, and I'll bring it back to you myself." She paused. "And whatever you decide about forgiving me, you were right to make this town learn his name. He should be remembered as a man. So should you." The son said nothing. He looked at her a moment longer, then turned and walked off into the snow, his shoulders bowed, leaving her alone at the foot of the courthouse steps, with his father's whole life in her trembling hands. Ruth held the diary against the blue scarf at her chest, and the snow came down on the silent street. And somewhere at the end of Maple Street, the frozen bridge waited under its white shroud, and she knew that whatever those pages held, she would not be the same woman after reading them. Ruth carried the worn leather diary home and did not open it until the house was dark and quiet around her. She made tea she would not drink, lit the lamp at the kitchen table, and sat a long while with the book closed under her hands, feeling the give of the soft corners, the warmth the leather seemed to hold from 31 years of a man's pocket. Then she opened it and began to read the life of the man she had killed. It was not what she expected. She had braced herself for accusation, for some final cruelty she could add to the letters. Instead, she found a quiet man, writing quietly to no one. There were entries about the weather on the line, about a stubborn switch near the mill that froze every January, about a son learning to ride a bicycle and falling and refusing to cry. There were years where Thomas Brennan wrote of his wife's long illness in short, careful sentences that held back more grief than they spoke, and then a single line on a date in autumn that simply said, "She is gone. I do not know how to be a father by myself, but I will learn it." Ruth read for hours. Cedar Falls slept. The man rose off the pages, ordinary and whole, a widower who had raised a boy alone and loved a railway line and taught his son to stand his ground. And she grieved him now not as an abstraction or a verdict, but as a person she had come, too late and too strangely, to know. It was the last entry she had been both seeking and dreading. In the final pages, the hand grew older, the ink less sure. He wrote of a co-worker, a younger man, who had been hurt the previous winter when a coupling failed, and of how it had shaken him to see how fast a life on the line could end. And then, near the very last page, dated only weeks before December, Thomas Brennan had written something that made Ruth set the book down and press her hand to her mouth. "I have had a good run, more than most. If my time comes out here on the cold iron, as it well might, I find I am not afraid of it. I only ask, if I am given any say in the matter, that it count for something, that it not be wasted on nothing. Let it be for someone, if it must come. That is all a man can hope, in the end, to matter on the way out." Ruth sat in the lamplight and wept, quietly, the way she had not let herself weep since the bridge. She had come to these pages hoping, against all reason, for proof, for some line that said he had seen her, that he had understood, that the nod had been real. There was no such line. Of course there was not. He had written this weeks before and could not have known. The diary settled nothing about that single frozen second on the spur. Her own memory was still a poor and failing witness, and the snow had still been thick, and her eyes still old and full of tears. But she understood now that proof was not the thing she needed, and never had been. The disease had taught her that certainty was a comfort she could no longer afford, that one day she would not even be sure of Walter's face. She had spent her whole life waiting for the world to hand her solid ground to stand on, and the world had declined. What was left, the only thing left, was to choose, to decide, as an act of will and not of evidence, what she would carry. And here, in his own failing hand, was a man who had hoped his death might be for someone, who had asked the cold iron to let it count. She would choose to believe that on the bridge, In his last second, he had seen an old woman save 5 children and had been granted his one wish, and had nodded to tell her so. She could not prove it. She would believe it anyway. That was hers to give, and no illness could take a thing freely chosen. She closed the diary and laid it gently beside Walter's blue scarf on the table, the 2 of them together in the lamplight, the dead man and the dead husband, the 2 souls she carried. And for the first time since December, something in her chest came loose, and a peace she had not earned and could not name settled over her, and she slept that night, deeply, without dreaming. And in the stillness before she slept, her mind turned, the way it had been turning for weeks, to the telephone, to Diane's voice on the line the afternoon of the verdict, uncertain, 1,100 miles away, asking if she was all right and not quite daring to say more. They had hung up with everything still unspoken, 3 years of silence cracked, but not mended. And Ruth had been waiting, she realized, for her daughter to be the one to call again, the way she had waited 4 years for Diane to reach first. She was done waiting. She had read tonight what a man leaves behind when the words run out for good, and she would not let her own last entries be a silence. Tomorrow she would lift the telephone herself. She woke at dawn to a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, a young woman she did not know stood on the step in the pale morning light, her eyes red at the rims, looking at Ruth as though afraid to speak. The young woman did not speak at first. She stood in the pale spring light with snow melting along the edges of Maple Street, her hands buried in the pockets of a gray coat, and she looked at Ruth the way people look at a photograph they are afraid to touch. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "you won't remember me. I was on the bus." Ruth's hand tightened on the door frame. The whole winter rushed back through her, the cold lever, the yellow shape sliding, the orange coat below. She had imagined those children 1,000 times, but never once pictured them grown. "My name is Rosa Alvarez. I was 9 years old." The young woman's voice trembled, then steadied. "I'm a nurse now, at St. Bridget's, 2 towns over. I've wanted to come for 4 months, and I kept driving past your street and turning back at the corner." Ruth opened the door wider. "Then you'd better come in out of the cold." She made coffee in the percolator that still brewed for 2, and this time she set the second cup in front of Rosa, who wrapped both hands around it without drinking. The kitchen was quiet but for the old clock and the slow drip at the window, where the blue scarf lay folded on the sill. It would have been easy for the girl to say thank you and leave, but Rosa had not driven all that way for that, and when she finally spoke, it was something harder. "I have to tell you something, and I'm afraid you'll hate me." She pressed her thumb to the rim of the cup. "When they put you on trial, I didn't come forward. I read about the other parents testifying, and I stayed home. I told myself I had exams, that it wasn't my place. The truth is I was a coward. A man died so I could grow up, and when you needed someone to stand for you, I watched it on the news." Ruth was silent. The honesty landed in the place where her own doubts lived, and she found she could not offer easy absolution because she had spent her life mistrusting it. "Why did you stay away?" Ruth asked, the way a teacher asks the question behind the question. "Because every time I think of that day, I think, why me? Why did I get my whole life when Mr. Brennan lost his Rosa's voice cracked. "I became a nurse because of it. I tell people it's a beautiful story. The real reason is I've spent 16 years trying to be worth a man's life. And I'm so tired. I came here because I thought if anyone would understand that weight, it would be you." There it was. Not gratitude. Not a tidy ending. Another soul carrying the very stone Ruth carried, sitting at her table, asking not to be thanked, but understood. "I don't have an answer to why you," Ruth said at last. "I've prayed for one about myself for months and never gotten it. But I'll tell you what I've come to believe. The man who died kept a diary. In it, he wrote that if he had to go, he hoped it would be for somebody. You weren't a debt he paid, Rosa. You were a hope he had." She laid her old hand over the girl's young one. "You don't owe the world your exhaustion. You owe it your living. It took me 67 years to learn the difference." Rosa wept then, and Ruth let her, and did not fill the silence with comfort she did not have. After a while, the girl wiped her face, embarrassed, and asked if she could come back sometime, and Ruth said yes. "Please, the second cup gets lonely." When Rosa had gone, Ruth stood a long while at the window, the girl's confession still warm in the room, that terrible question, why was I worth a man's life? The same stone Ruth had carried up from the bridge. She thought of a young woman who had driven past her street for 4 months, turning back every time, afraid. And she thought of her own daughter, 1,100 miles away, and of the call on the day of the verdict that had cracked the silence and then stopped short, both of them too frightened to push the door any wider. She had told Rosa not to give the world her exhaustion, but her living. It was time she took her own advice. She crossed to the telephone on the wall, the one that had rung only once in months, and this time she was the one to dial. It rang twice. Diane answered, wary, and Ruth did not let the old fear close her throat. "Diane," she said, "it's your mother. I'm not calling about the trial. I'm calling because I want you to come home. You and the girl. I've waited 3 years for you to reach first, and I was wrong to. Please, come and see me while there's still time." There was a long silence on the line, and then, very quietly, her daughter said, "Okay, Mom, okay, we'll come." Ruth hung up the telephone and stood in the bright kitchen with her hand still on the receiver, and outside, the snow was melting from Maple Street, and the long winter was ending at last. The phone call lasted 4 minutes the first time. It was longer the second time, and longer still the third, and somewhere in the 7th or 8th conversation, across the weeks of a thawing spring, Diane stopped asking why and started asking when. She drove the 1,100 miles in 2 days with her own daughter in the back seat, a girl of 7 named after no one in particular. And she parked the car on Maple Street without quite knowing what she would say to the mother she had spent 3 years not calling. What she said, in the end, was almost nothing. She stood on the porch and looked at Ruth, who looked smaller than she remembered, and older, and she saw the blue scarf knotted at her mother's throat, the one her father had given her one Christmas a lifetime ago, and something in Diane's face came undone. They did not speak about the trial. They did not speak about the silence. Diane simply stepped forward and let her mother hold her, and the unsent letter, the one that had sat 11 days and then many more on the windowsill, was never sent, because there was no longer anything in it that needed saying. On a bright morning near the end of April, the three of them walked to the bridge over the Sauk Hill. Rosa came too, in her gray coat, because she had taken to visiting on her days off, and the second cup was rarely lonely now. The river ran high and brown with snowmelt, and the old iron switch stood rusted at the eastern end where it had always stood, and the spur curved away into the budding trees the way it had on the worst afternoon of Ruth's life. The little girl, Diane's daughter, ran ahead and put her hands on the cold rail and looked down at the water the way children do, fearlessly, as if the world had never once been dangerous. "Grandma," she said, for she had decided in the space of 2 days that this was what Ruth would be called. "Is this the bridge, the one from the story?" Ruth came and stood beside her. "It is." The child was quiet a moment, working something out behind her serious eyes. "Mom said you saved the kids on the bus, but the man on the tracks died." She turned and looked up, and there was no cruelty in it, only the clean and terrible honesty of the young. "Did you do the right thing?" It was the question. It had followed Ruth from the iron lever through the long winter, through the letters and the courtroom and the diary. The question David Okafor had asked her in her kitchen. The question Caroline Voss had hurled at the jury. The question she had once believed had an answer she was simply too cowardly to find. She had taught children for 40 years. She knew that the honest answer to a child is not always the comforting one, and that the comforting answer is not always a lie, and that the art of it is knowing which is needed. She crouched down, her old knees protesting, until her eyes were level with the girls. "I don't know if it was right," Ruth said. "I'll be honest with you, because you're old enough now to hear honest things. There wasn't a right thing to do that day. There was only a terrible thing and another terrible thing, and I had 5 seconds, and I chose the one I thought I could live with." She paused. The river moved below them. "But I'll tell you what I do know. The man who died. His name was Thomas. He wasn't a number on a track. He had a daughter and a son and 31 years of mornings just like this one. And the children on that bus, they had mornings too. None of them was worth more than the others. That's the part people get wrong. They think this was a sum, that you weigh 5 against 1 and the bigger number wins. It was never a sum. It was 1,000 whole lives. And I broke one of them, and I'll carry that for the rest of mine." The girl considered this with the gravity only a 7-year-old can summon. "So you don't know if it was right," she said slowly. "But you know it mattered who he was." Ruth felt the breath go out of her. In all the months of lawyers and prosecutors and her own circling thoughts, no one had put it so plainly. The child had walked straight past the question everyone argued about, and found the one that actually mattered. Yes, Ruth said. Her voice was not quite steady. That's exactly it. That's the whole thing. And it took me 67 years, and you about 10 seconds. The girl looked pleased with herself and went back to studying the water. Diane came and stood close, her hand finding her mother's shoulder, and Rosa watched from a little distance with her face turned up to the thin spring sun. Ruth straightened slowly and unwound the blue scarf from her throat. She did not throw it into the river. That would have been a gesture for a different kind of woman, a tidier kind of story. Instead, she draped it around her granddaughter's shoulders, where it pooled too long and too wide, and the child grinned at the silliness of it, and Walter's scarf went on into another life. They stood there a while longer, 4 of them on the bridge, and no one said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying. The river ran. The trees were greening. Somewhere 2 towns over, a girl Ruth had saved was alive enough to be tired and brave enough to come back. And a woman who had once believed her life no longer mattered to anyone stood with 3 generations gathered close in the cold, clean air, no longer invisible, no longer certain, and at last, after everything, no longer alone.